Okay, so before we do any modelling, because this is going to be some of our first modelling work, we want to plan it out very sort of meticulously. There are cases where you wouldn't do this much planning, of course, in the field, sort of, when you working in an actual studio. But because a lot can go wrong with your first few models, we're going to try and plan it out as well as we can to make sure that it sort of goes over smoothly. We're going to go for like a best case scenario. So the first thing I've got here is literally I've just typed hammerhead shark into Google because that's what I want to model, and I'm gathering a whole bunch of photos of these guys. They're all useful for varying reasons. This one's especially interesting because it's actually an X-ray of a hammerhead's noggin. These are really good if you can find X-rays if you're modeling an animal or whatever, because they give you quite a good sort of. I mean, you can see all the details because, like, everything's see-through, right? You can see the shape of the head, you can see where its eyes are and where its mouth is and all that kind of stuff. And X-rays are pretty close to sort of parallel lines shooting through, I'm pretty sure, because I don't know how else an X-ray would work. But that's really good because you get very little perspective distortion. If you find an X-ray of something, they're excellent for modeling references. They're almost like an orthogonal blueprint, you know. So that's a good one for form. This one here is a good side-on, even though it's quite low res. You can sort of mix your references around and get something usable. So you could sort of, trace over this to get yourself a nice sort of base of your outline, and then sort of detail it based on, you might take the teeth from this one, and you can see here that the skull's quite sort of undulating shape there. Well, you can sort of see that here as well. They vary a little bit, of course, like all living things do. They don't have to be, it's not high tolerance machinery. It's you can sort of fudge things a little bit with living things, which is cool. This one's a little bit skinny. It doesn't look like it's had much food in a while. You can see these other ones have like a big lump there, and I think that's a good detail, so I've carried that across to my concept. You can see again this has some lumps on its head, sort of thing. This one's really good because you can see the shape of the mouth when it's open, and later on you can use this kind of reference with the close-up stuff for texturing, because you can see that it's not just wide underbelly and this velvety sort of grey on top. It's got this transition with the sort of freckly sort of thing, and you can see the inside of the mouth, which is handy. This one's good because it's almost an underside shot. You're very seldom going to get perfect orthogonal views of living creatures, but this one's pretty good for you've got to pay close attention to the forms of these kind of things and how far they stick out from the side of the body, whether they're attached at the bottom or attached halfway up the side of the body. That kind of stuff you want to really pay attention. You can see there's sort of a line flowing through here where all the fins are sort of attached to, and it converges here, and then you've got just the one fin instead of the symmetrical ones. Stuff like that is pretty important. You can see sort of how much of there's like a sort of bump here for its dorsal fin. It comes up a little bit. It sort of gets fatter in the middle. This one's another good one because you can see the transition on the front of its head between the top tonality of its body and the lower. You can also see that if its head is in that position for whatever reason, you can sort of see the gills fold up because they sort of curl around to the bottom a little bit. They're not just on the sides like you might, the point of all the reference gathering sort of stuff is because if you were to just say I'm going to draw a shark and draw what you think it looks like, it's not always going to come out how they actually look, like you might, if you were going to draw this and just base it on that, you'd just be like, I'll draw some lines on the side of its body. I guess the gills are on the side of the body, but actually, if you have a look here, they sort of curl all the way around, so it's really important to pay attention to that kind of stuff from all different angles. It's a study thing, which you'll get better at as time goes on. You'll notice, a year after you finish your first few models, you'll look back at them and say, wow, I can't believe I didn't notice that this was so wrong, sort of thing. But it's it's just a part of learning, and I guess I'm trying to help you get into that frame of mind where you just go into as much reference as you can and really try and pay attention to all that kind of stuff. So the other thing to just quickly point out is poses like this, if you're doing creatures with a lot of sort of motion in them, like these, they're pretty good for this one too, with the mouth open. These are good references to keep, not just for modeling and texturing. These are good ones for the animation stuff. So it's not only you've got to plan your geometry in a way that it will animate nicely and not sort of crumple into a disfigured mess, but also for the animators to know what the kind of range of motions that these things need to have, and you know, if they feel like you haven't provided them with enough geometry, they'll come back at you and say, you know, we can't do this, we can't make its mouth open that wide or whatever, you need to make some more cuts here so it's not so deformed or whatever. You'll get things like that, but that's, you know, that's further down the line. So, you know, it's when you're hunting your references, get everything, because it's all useful stuff, especially in crazy poses like that. So we're going to talk about the actual 2D art stuff. So this is something I've already done, obviously, but based on a few photos and stuff that I grabbed off the internet, you'll notice that I've only done a side and a top view. It's because basically a front and a back view of a hammerhead shark doesn't have that much information in it, and the bottom view is not very different from the top view. So if you were to model an object which was very different from the top versus the bottom, you will need to, you know, do top and bottom as well. But most of the details can sort of just be inferred from some of these concepts and stuff, and you should always have these on hand if you need to hand them over to some other artist. So that brings me to the next point. The main purpose of drawing a concept piece, it doesn't have to look fancy, you know. I mean, I've done some shading on it here, which I'll explain later, but it's not to look good. It's not, you know, you'll buy all these art books and stuff from, you know, certain game productions, like really AAA, huge blockbuster sort of things, and most of the stuff in there isn't actually what they would have used for model production. It's something, you know, people would have knocked up concepts for modeling off very, very quickly in a very short amount of time. They'll usually put in those books things like key concepts, which are just, they're sort of an overall mood sort of thing, and it's more about, like, they do matte painting and all this kind of crazy stuff that's like very detailed and time consuming. But with this kind of thing, you don't want to spend as much time as you would actually modeling it, otherwise you would just actually model it, you know. So the idea is to communicate to the modelers, or you in this case, you know, you want to communicate to yourself in this one as detailed of a plan as you can. You want to know what needs to go where for the model to resolve the way you want it to. So what I want to explain really quickly is an important concept when you're doing this kind of stuff, like plans for people to model from. You want to make their job pretty easy. You don't want them to have to mess around and try and figure out how anything works. You don't want to do anything called, well, colloquially known as 2D cheating. And that's kind of like, I've got an example here, which is actually a print from MC Escher. And MC Escher's whole shtick was doing things that work in 2D space, like this crazy sort of fountain thingy aqueduct. But this could not possibly be modelled in 3D. If you know any of MC Escher's work, you know what I mean? Like this, it just would not resolve properly. It'd be a nightmare to try and model in any view other than this exact one. So when you provide different views for modelling, you want them to line up, right? So if I was to trace these down, they should at least roughly line up. These are, you know, some of them are a little bit off, but they're pretty mostly okay, because, you know, this is a pretty rough little concept. Everything sort of lines up closely enough. This is the only one that's a little bit off, but it's still usable. So again, it's never going to be 1,000,000% perfect, but you should try and get it as good as you can. You want to avoid things that you can sort of, you know, in a perspective view especially. You get a lot of perspective views to model from in the workplace, and people will just sort of like noodle around and draw whatever they want and not actually think about how it fits together. And that's really important, because sometimes you'll have a concept piece sent off because, you know, the art directors looked at it and said, you know, yeah, that's approved, we want it to look like this. And when you're modeling it, you're expected to make it look like the concept, right? And if you can't do that because your 2D artist has done some 2D cheating, right, it puts you in a pretty interesting position, because you have to sort of defend yourself as to why you had to model it a certain way, because whatever the 2D artist drew doesn't work properly. Oops. So that's a really important point to go over, and you want to, especially if you want to go into this field where you might have to draw some concepts, you really want to try and make sure that you don't get the 3D guys in trouble for not making it look like the concept, especially if you have to do the concept and the 3D yourself, because then it's like you didn't deliver on what you said you were going to do, right? It doesn't look like the concept, and they will. There are cases where art directors will, if it's a really important IP, like if it's like a popular kids cartoon or whatever, they'll actually take the concept and put the 3D model over the top of it and expect it to match up like perfectly, right? Because these are recognizable. They're trademarks, right? And They'll be quite meticulous about making sure that it's exactly right. So it's a bit of a pain, but try and get it as good as you can, because even though you will get some bad concepts when you're working, we're going to treat this as a best case scenario where everything goes smoothly and all your concepts are perfect because you did them perfectly for yourself and blah 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 blah. So the next thing to mention is a topology plan. Okay, so the topology plan is kind of a complicated one because it's something that we teach, but as you go on, you'll realize that you become more competent in modeling, and you'll be able to see an object and sort of like, bang, like I know how I'm going to build that. I know where the flows are going to go, where the edges are going to be tight, where they're going to be sort of spread out a little bit more. What's going to be quads, what's going to have to be triangles, all that kind of stuff. You can plan that kind of stuff out in your head, but for now, you can treat this as sort of like your training wheels for that. You want to get yourself to a point where you understand topology and polygon flow and all that kind of stuff. Without having to really plan it out explicitly, but for now we're planning it out explicitly, or close to. I mean, it's never going to be exact, because again, you wouldn't spend hours and hours making sure that you can, that everything's perfectly modeled out as a mesh, because that would take just as long as actually modeling it. But you want to get a good idea of sort of like how things are going to flow. And the big one you got to think about is when you go back to your references, sort of have a look at how this is going to bend and how what parts sort of logically move in sort of in certain ways, right? So if I just create a new layer and sort of start doodling over this, right, you can see there's some shapes going like this, and that sort of you want to sort of make like a topographic map, like those maps that show the contour lines. That's the things you want to focus on. You want to get the contours right so that you have nice smooth sort of nice smooth shading over everything, because your topology, which is this sort of the actual structure of the mesh, that's what decides how everything shades. And you want to make sure that everything's like, if it's a nice long slender thing that can bend, you want plenty of these things around here so it can bend, And obviously you're going to have to think about things like this and how they're going to fit in. You're going to have to figure out how they're going to connect up, like at the bottom there, and think about things like how many sides are going to be here, and how many sides you're actually going to need, and whether you're going to collapse some of these. Maybe you might connect some of them together so you don't use too many towards the end. You don't want like a crazy dense thing here and then like a big nice flowing thing here. Like it's kind of an inappropriate use of extra detail. You want to make sure that this kind of thing can sort of flow out into this stuff. Like, it might not look exactly like that, but that's just an example. You might do a few of these when you're just practicing to figure out what you want to do, right? You gotta, just sort of think about it a little bit and have a little play around, sort of trace some things and see what works. Simple is generally better, okay, for this kind of thing. If you can do things without having sort of crazy, like, wacky things connected up in insane ways, it's easier, because animators will be thanking you because they can just grab things, like if they're in nice even loops like this, they can just do a big loop select and grab things, like grab parts of that, and they can go along the body if you've got it like this, and they can just almost automatically get that nicely smoothly rigged, instead of if you've got wonky stuff everywhere, they'll be like, oh, what's this, man, this is going to animate badly. So I mean, you can do this on your concept piece. It might, you want to start with your big lines, your sort of big ones that carry along the entire piece. So I'm doing this with a mouse, which is bad. You want to use a Wacom if you can, but I figure you guys aren't. You're going to be using a Wacom, so I'm not going to do these perfect lines that you guys might have trouble coming up with. It doesn't have to be perfect either. That's the other thing I want to sort of make clear with you. So what you can see here is I'm sort of, it's at this end I've sort of started the cuts on this sort of curved sort of trajectory, because I know that they've got to merge into the head, right? Because eventually that's got to come out to the sides. So like I'm going to have these curved parts, and then I'm going to start extruding these parts out of that. And I know that once they actually get to there, it's got to be the right shape. It's got to have this sort of airfoil shape to it. So I've got to curve them gradually as they come there. but by the time they get here, they've almost got to go the other way, you know, they've got to start. And you want that transition to be sort of gradual. You don't want it to be this one curved and then this one straight, right? You want it to sort of flow out, almost like sort of like ripples in the water, you know. And obviously you've got to keep in mind things like this. You want to have a cut here and probably a cut here, because then you can start using this geometry here to build the fin out of. You need, you know, if you start having to cut fins halfway into these, it'll start looking ugly and it'll sort of break your flow. So if you can space it out nicely so that your fin cuts are, you know, I mean, I'd probably even go like this, drag this one up here, so that this same edge loop can be the start of this fin here as well. And because this one's so wide, I'd probably have a few. I'd probably have like, you know, 3 cuts or whatever, which might not be what I actually end up doing, but this is part of the sort of planning phase, and you got to figure out how you'd do all that. And again, you kind of want to think about the economy of what you're doing. You want to try and reuse as many edge loops as you can. I've already got a loop going up here, so that might as well become part of the fin. I don't have to create anything new there, right? And the same, it just keeps going on and on down here. I'd have to have at least one cut there. I might spread these out a little bit to sort of cover some more if you get like a nice even. That's the other thing to mention actually. You want kind of even cuts along the length of something. You want it to sort of, if you think about, you know, you've got one poly here, right? You want that one poly to represent a pretty similar amount of space in the 3D world, right? There are some cases like the tip of the fin where you're going to need heaps to stack up and sort of give it that rounded look, but in such a small area. But especially with the big slab-sided things like this, you want to have a polygon be roughly the same size. Like, I mean, for an example, I'll just erase some of these. You don't want to have something like that. Even if I took this whole loop out, that's kind of, it's not great, because what you have then is, if you're animating it, say, you have, say it's curving like this, and this is from the top view or whatever, you might have something really nice and curved here, and then all of a sudden you'll have these straight big long lines and then nice curve again on the other side. So you want to have consistency, right? You want to have roughly even spacing between these. You never get it perfectly, you know, even, but that's not totally important. As long as you consider it and you have a go at getting some nice even spacing between it all. So as these come down, similar thing. Now I've assumed I'm going to use 3 edge loops for this one and 3 for this one. So if you don't already know what an edge loop is from reading any of the reading material, it's basically, you've got a cylinder, right? This is a really badly drawn cylinder. You'll have loops running around it. These are edge loops, and they're connected by edge rings, I guess. This, if you were to pick this edge, this is the ring, and this is the loop. Okay, so what else can we do? And that's you can select by loop and ring in Max, and that's why, another reason why you want to keep things nice and clean, because anyone who's got to use the model after you and do things to it can just sort of quickly pick things by loop or ring. Especially animators, they like that. They're fans. Now this, the tail is kind of arbitrary geometry. I know I'm going to continue some of these up here somewhere, you know, but to be honest, this doesn't have to move all that much, so the flow of it isn't important so much, and we can sort of resolve that on the fly as we go. I know it'll be something like that, and how this all comes together at the end is going to be, you know, I'll figure it out when I get there. You don't, again, like I said, you don't want to spend ages planning it. When you're in a professional setting, all this kind of stuff would happen very automatically in your head. To be honest, I could do the same down here, but it's pretty much going to be the same stuff. It's just going to be more of this, more of these cuts and things. In other scenarios, you might have to do different things for top and side, but this is, like, the sharks are very sort of, I mean, it's got roughly that contour from all sides, pretty much, so it's not going to look that much different from side and top. But, oh, these are kind of important, I guess, these little things, although I've kind of done it there already. You want to sort of, again, you don't want it to be, you don't want to go with the skull, you don't want it to be, you know, you've got this curve thing here to make this nice sort of head shape, and then all of a sudden just have it like that. You want to sort of gradually give it, you know, the geometry it needs, because then it flows a lot more nicely, and you can sort of, again, similar thing. You don't want to go from this shape to just a straight line or anything like that. You want to sort of follow things out and feel how it flows. You can do it it's very sort of intuitive the way you do it. It's just something that looks nice and natural and sort of curvy. You want to really focus on getting all your curves nice and consistent from all angles if you can. I mean, always have a look, like if you want to get really nice curvy sort of polyflow, you might want to put your camera down like here somewhere in 3ds Max and look that way, and look down this edge as if it's like a train track or something, and you'll be able to see, like, because there's a lot of perspective, you'll be able to see little wonky bits, and you can correct them manually, which might not show up from the side, you know, like this might be jutting in a little bit on here, it might be going in like this for all you know. So always check all that stuff, check everything from all angles and make sure it's nice and smooth, and that's good topology if you can do that. It's hard and it's pretty time consuming to have to push things around manually, but it's a very, very pleasing end result if you can get nice smooth curves going in all directions, all these sort of compound curves working together. The other thing to mention is you might want to consider having some edge loops sort of following these gill lines. I would probably leave them relatively undetailed, because I'll just sculpt them in later in a sculpting program in sort of high res. And then in the final low poly, I would probably just cut them in arbitrarily without having to really worry too much about the flow, because they are very jarring. They don't flow very nicely, and there's not much you can do about that. I would cut them in at the end. What else? I guess that's pretty much all you need to know. But of course, always refer back to your references and have a look at how these things sort of happen. You can see there's lines running down here. You can sort of trace where everything's going, and make sure that you kind of keep all your, like this has obviously got to be puffed out a little bit, so you know, keep all these kind of different silhouettes in mind when you're planning out your topology of these guys, or you know, any model you're doing, always keep that stuff in mind. Yeah, so that's about it for the topology plan, and I hope that's sort of enough to get you thinking in the right way. You should be able to eventually sort of see an object and think, oh, okay, that's where I'm going to make these sort of edge loops, that's where I'm going to cut the rings in. I'm going to need, you know, you should just know off the top of your head eventually, obviously not now, don't be too hard on yourself, but you should know eventually that if you're going to put a fin here, you're going to need some geometry here and there to accommodate that. Otherwise you're going to have to cut it in later and it'll be ugly and there'll be bits hanging off everywhere and blah blah blah. So be economical, reuse as much as you can. If you can have this one edge loop that just flows all the way up into the top of the fin, do it. That's really good. Don't kill yourself doing it, but anything that logically will flow, make it flow. Okay, that's it.